We simply can't leave till we get some more wood. Oh, we're not keen.
In the wake of Bullfrog Productions' decline, many of its alumni went on to join or found other studios. Arguably the most notable of these would be Lionhead, founded by Peter Molyneux, who had originally founded Bullfrog alongside Les Edgar. Lionhead is best known for their work on the Fable series of RPGs, but their first release would be the cult classic God game Black and White. The combination of ambitious, flawed, and hard to get a copy of these days has led Black and White to be a fond memory in the minds of many players, though one I suspect wouldn't hold up quite so well in their estimations in the present. It's not bad, mind you, I'm not in the habit of talking about games I don't like, but its experimental mechanics and unfocused gameplay loop leave it a difficult work to place in the modern industry. As the moniker might suggest, you take on the role of a fledgling god. One of many, but not as a member of a polytheistic pantheon, more a competitive monotheism. All-powerful and all-knowing, at least as far as your followers are concerned. It's a very biblical view of godhood, but whether you lean more towards the loaves and fishes of the New Testament or the fire and brimstone of the Old is up to you. I set out to be neutral. I'm always interested to see whether games with morality systems really offer freedom of choice or simply a moral binary where you're forced to fully commit one way or the other. To Black and White's credit, it falls into the former category. The visual changes to your temple, your cursor, and even the land you control as your alignment shifts in one direction or the other happens gradually and subtly enough that you're unlikely to ever see them change, but they have a large cumulative impact over time. The mechanical impact is negligible though, which is good actually. Had the game tied certain miracles to one extreme or the other, it would have fallen into the trap of a binary choice. But by making the changes only visual, you are free to pursue your reign as you see fit, as long as you accept the fact that the game will judge you for it. That said, when I say the mechanical impact is negligible, I mean it as far as how it will affect the options available to you and the way you play. It will still have an impact on what happens. The specifics of the game's mechanics, its focus on expansion and resource management, means that playing deliberately evil will make your life far harder than being good. Specific quests may be easier to complete. It certainly takes longer to find a woman's sick husband in return for the item you need than it does to smash her house and take it, but your day-to-day management is made more difficult by needlessly wasting resources on killing your own people and burning their houses. Arguably, a smaller population means less resources are needed, but in reality, you need to be growing your area of influence, and doing that requires growing your flock. I'm going to admit up front, I never quite worked out the rhythm Black and White wanted me to follow. I couldn't quite balance resources while also expanding as quickly as it seemed to want me to, and the results slowed things down considerably. Most levels in the game are difficult to truly lose, but very easy to hamstring yourself by using up all of your available resources and making progressing an incredibly slow process. Failing to meet your followers' needs, or indeed letting them die, is considered an evil act in the same way actively killing them would be, and as a result, despite my best efforts, the game labelled me an evil god. I don't think I was an evil god, but I'll admit I was a bad one. Maxing out your morality at good is actually very difficult. Being good is hard, but being evil will make things harder for you in the long run, so maybe the game has a more nuanced view of morality than I gave it credit for. To be fair to myself, I don't think I was the only one who wasn't sure of the rhythm the game was aiming for. The game seems confused as well. Each of the 5 islands you visit throughout the game features their own challenges and have their own twist on the gameplay, but that leads to the problem that it's difficult to tell what that base gameplay is meant to be in the first place. The first island makes up your basic tutorial, with the second being an extended tutorial that ends about halfway through the island. As a result, the game only really gives one half of an island of what it might consider the standard rhythm of play before throwing curveballs at you and forcing you to play differently. The only island that gives you the space and freedom to experiment without some form of pressing external matter creating additional time pressure is the first, but the tutorial island is lacking many of the mechanics that the game requires you rely on. Instead, the tutorial island tends to focus on only the most basic methods of playing the game. These basic mechanics of interacting with the world are detailed extensively. Great pains are taken to integrate all information and as many controls as possible diegetically. Dragging the mouse to move around isn't a particularly revolutionary mechanic even for 2001, but the simple addition of making the hand you control grab the ground, in combination with the inertia that movement imparts on the camera, gives the movement a real sense of physicality. The same is true of interacting with objects. Objects slow your cursor's movement when you're holding them, even more when you're preparing to throw them. You get a genuine feel for how heavy or light an object is by how you move it. It's a great touch that adds a level of immersion that I suspect is a big part of how memorable the game is. The entire game can be played with just a mouse, though updates did add keyboard shortcuts for various features to streamline the process. The dedication to diegetic interaction doesn't end with the controls, however. There's no UI aside from some simple tooltips, so every bit of information is gained by interacting with the world somehow. Hover over a desire flag to see how much of that resource the villagers need, or knock on a house to see how many occupants it holds. More complex information about your realm and its population is held upon the scrolls within your temple, a magnificent structure containing various rooms with different information within them. But while the most basic mechanical interactions are explained almost too extensively, other more complex concepts are glossed over almost entirely. In the same way that knowing how the pieces move doesn't teach you how to play chess, knowing how to toss objects around and cast miracles doesn't teach you how to play black and white. In some ways this opens the game up to experimentation, which is a positive. More complex problems such as resource management and dealing with settlements you don't control yet are reasonable problems to leave the player to work out. But as drawn out and detailed as the tutorials for movement and interaction are, there are some very basic gameplay elements that are never explained. For example, belief, prayer power, and influence. These sound like similar things, but they are very distinct. Belief is your control over a settlement. You gain it by performing miracles within view of their villagers. When you have enough, you gain control of the settlement, and if another god gains more, they take control. Meanwhile, prayer points govern your ability to perform miracles. You gain them by having followers worship at your temple. These two are simple enough to understand and are explained briefly. Influence is not. Your area of influence is the zone in which you can interact with the world directly. It's displayed as a ring on the ground centered on your temple and settlements. You can interact with objects a little way outside of it, but not far and not for long, so growing your influence is one of the most important factors in the core gameplay loop, whether you're combating other gods or not. The problem is, the game never tells you how to expand your influence. It's some combination of population and belief, but other factors appear to influence it as well. The wonders you can build seem to affect it greatly, but only if they're closer to the edge of your influence. They don't expand it directly though, they don't simply create influence around them, they just make the ring around your settlements larger by some unspecified amount. The result is, without any clear indication as to how that mechanic works, you're never clear on how you're meant to be making progress. The instances where you're given a clear mechanic and left to experiment as to how best to achieve your goal works well, but when you're left to puzzle out how the mechanic even works, the game slows to a crawl, and since you're likely to be beset by dwindling resources or expanding opponents, being slow to start can lead to ever worsening problems hours later. The most likely of these problems is resource management. Food, it turns out, is relatively simple. Have enough farms to feed your population, and they'll mostly manage by themselves, propped up with the occasional miracle. Wood, on the other hand, is a constant problem. Black and White is, in its way, a spiritual successor to Populous, the game that both put Bullfrog on the map and birthed the god game genre all at once. While Populous had an array of miracles and some control over your worshippers, the primary method of interaction with the game was raising or lowering the land to create flat areas for your people to build and expand into. In Black and White, the ground stays firmly where it is, but you're still going to be doing a lot of landscaping. Your followers can, and will, strip the land bare of trees if left to their own devices, and far more wood than is present in the world is necessary for expansion, so one of your biggest expenditures of time in the game is in forest management. While there are miracles to help, for the most part you need to make sure you're growing and replanting forests to ensure a steady supply of wood. Ideally, you need to find somewhere remote to do this, partly so your own villagers don't chop down all the saplings and mess things up, partly so the expanding enemy god doesn't decide to clip all your trees for themselves. Balancing prayer generation to keep you in the miracles you need to both stockpile wood and grow your own forests to ensure a steady supply, then further balancing that against the expansion needs of your people is one of the most important loops in the game. Failure to maintain the balance will either leave you underexpanded and at the mercy of your opponents, or struggling to get resources after you accidentally left the land barren and are forced to rely only on what miracle wood you can generate through prayers. Your followers themselves don't need nearly as much attention as the forests, surprisingly. They'll gripe and moan if their expansion needs aren't met, but they'll feed themselves as long as you provided enough farms. The only exception is active worshippers at your temple. They need manual feeding and the occasional heal, but the village itself is mostly able to manage itself. If you've equipped the village with a creche for the young and a graveyard for the dead, there's little more you need to worry about. You can set people specific jobs, but doing so as a long-term measure is often more trouble than it's worth. A dedicated breeder or two will overpopulate your village far quicker than you're able to provide housing, and foresters will only speed the rate of deforestation. Beyond popping back to check on them and place down new scaffolds for building, you'll be spending most of your time impressing new villagers, tending to the woods, or dealing with your creature. Your creature represents possibly Black and White's deepest and most complex mechanic, but also its most opaque by far. You get him after completing the first few quests of the tutorial, and it will travel with you not just throughout the rest of the game, but also into any multiplayer or skirmish maps you happen to play on with that profile. There's a choice of 3 to start with, but you can switch to various others throughout the game. Different creatures will have different strengths and weaknesses, but none are capable of anything the others can't do as well. The creature serves 2 primary purposes. The first, and simplest, is to act on your behalf outside your influence. You can send them off to grab items for you that you can't reach, or to interact with far-off villages. The second is as a sort of semi-automated helper. The creature can be trained to perform various tasks. I say can be, actually he needs to be trained in various tasks. Even tasks as simple as eating and sleeping will require your guidance. It's these training mechanics that are the most obfuscated. Most things it will learn passively by watching you or your villagers doing it, such as placing items in the storehouse or casting miracles. Others you need to take the time to show them specifically. Either way, you then need to reinforce its actions through praise or discipline. When it successfully collects fish to feed itself, you can stroke it to reinforce that behaviour. On the other hand, if it eats a villager, you can slap the shit out of it to discourage that sort of thing. Disciplining your creature can be pretty brutal actually, but it's the only way the game gives you to discourage it, and you do really need it to not eat all of your villagers. This all sounds simple enough, but the devil is in the details, and the details are never apparent. It's unclear how complex or how specific this training can be. Training it to eat what you want it to, but also to only eat when it's hungry seems possible, but training it to generate food with a miracle when it's hungry doesn't seem to be. It seems like you can teach it complex tasks, but it might only seem that way. You could teach it to take trees and replant them, then water the trees to generate saplings so more trees grow, but I have no idea if it's actually learning to do those things in tandem, or if reinforcing each action is just causing them to happen in tandem. Is it really learning to create food for the villagers' store when the flag shows they need food, or does it just happen to make food randomly because I praised it for doing so? how much or how little you actually praise or punish it for actions does seem to create a hierarchy of actions, but how it chooses to follow those I have no idea. The result is a creature that is difficult to manage, and even more difficult to work out whether it's actually learning what you're teaching it at all, or just copying it once and then wandering off to do other things. Beyond some very basic information about the miracles it can cast and its current status in your temple, you're left mostly to observe and try to work it out for yourself. However, far from being a drawback, this obfuscation is likely the system's greatest strength. The system is likely far simpler than it seems, but without being able to see what's going on behind the scenes, the player can easily ascribe complexity to it. When your creature seems to start acting weird, a clearer system would make it easy to detect if the mechanics are screwing up, but without being able to say for sure what is actually going on under the hood, it's far easier to ascribe those oddities to an imagined personality. It becomes so very easy to anthropomorphize and feel connected to it. It's actually a lot like modern generative AI in that way. Modern AI chatbots are little more than a procedurally generated statistical algorithm that uses complex vector maths and statistical analysis to guess what the right words are, but without seeing that happen, it's easy to ascribe intelligence and even consciousness to it. The difference is, the creature of Black and White doesn't have such vast negative environmental and societal impacts. At least, not in the real world. In Black and White, my idiot horse son's refusal to stop throwing fireballs in the house caused quite a lot of environmental and societal impact there. I'll admit I wasn't a good dad to the creature any more than I was a good god to my people, and that ultimately would be my downfall. He was just another way I never quite got into the rhythm the game expected me to. I didn't take enough time out in the second land to properly train him, because I was too busy trying to stop my villagers from chopping down every tree they could reach before starving to death. I was never able to get him to actually be useful, beyond sending him to hang out in villages I hadn't taken over yet to gradually build belief in them. The game really benefits from multiple playthroughs, or at the very least a few false starts to get accustomed to everything, because as I mentioned earlier, there's not enough time spent in whatever the game might consider its baseline method of play. The second island is the closest you get, but only after the extended tutorial is over and your allied god has been killed. This only leaves you with 1 or 2 villages to capture before the island is over, and depending on how slow you've been, the island might already be mostly barren at that point, leaving you little time to really get into the flow of managing your followers, your creature, and your land. The third island switches things up by taking your creature away entirely. You're left to capture each village without his help at all, culminating in an excruciatingly slow grind to push your influence far enough along the island to reach the last village. The fourth land features no competing god, but instead inundates you with natural disasters from the start, so you need to balance protecting your fledgling village and rushing to complete the objectives necessary to stop fireballs raining from the sky. Finally, the fifth island restricts the use of your creature again by weakening him, flipping its alignment to the opposite of yours, and gradually shrinking it over time. This isn't a bad mechanic in itself, it's quite a good twist that increases the difficulty of the island proportional to the skill of the player. If they trained their creature well, grew them big and strong, and came to rely on them, they're going to be at a major disadvantage. My idiot son, on the other hand, barely felt the effects of the curse, and since I was likely evil, he didn't even shift his alignment much, since what little training I had managed had taught him to be at least vaguely good. For those of you keeping track, however, that means you only have your creature with you and at full capacity for around 2 islands. His learning abilities seem to be curtailed in the initial tutorial, he's missing in action entirely from the end of 2 until the end of 3, and he's significantly reduced in strength in the final island. You only have your creature in its default, fully capable state for most of the second and fourth islands, and in both of those you're too busy to really get to grips with training him, since in the first you're still learning the basics of managing your settlements, and in the second there are fireballs raining from the sky. It might not surprise you at this point that my playthrough stalled at the final island. All the problems of previous islands are present, but you start with even fewer resources and no immediate access to the miracles that allow you to generate resources from prayer points. The types of miracles you have access to are tied to the villages you take over, and you won't be able to generate wood or create instant forests until you've taken over one of the 3 major settlements that are helping to curse your creature. The problem is this makes expansion agonizingly slow, since you need to be extra careful not to wipe out your own wood supply. Meanwhile, your opponent expands quickly and will likely start deforesting your half of the island before long. The game expects you to bring resources and villages from previous islands with you, but it doesn't actually do a great job of indicating this. The first time you change islands, you're being narratively hurried along, which strongly implies you're only meant to grab what you can quickly and move. This last land seems to expect you to have spent some time on land 4 building up wood, food, and villagers to bring with you, not to mention a supply of pre-built scaffolds and possibly even some one-shot miracles. My first time through, the map slowed to a crawl, and I hit a stalemate. I restarted with some more resources and a plan. Of the 3 major settlements, one of them seemed far easier to convert than the others, easy enough that I could send my creature over to take it himself. The only problem being, the direct land route was blocked off by the other god electrocuting him to a crisp and then setting his own creature on the charred remains. By the time I'd given up my first run, my creature had become very small indeed, but if he was large enough, I think he could cross the bay separating the village from my starting area. He could then take the village, giving me access to some better miracles, as well as a foothold for taking the rest of the map. A great plan with one minor flaw. Since I had failed to properly look after my idiot son, he hadn't grown to nearly the maximum size a creature can reach. In fact, he was still so short he couldn't cross the shallow water I needed him to, even after restarting the land. I then restarted again, but lingered in the previous map longer, hoping to grow him more. No luck. He was already past the age where growth mostly stops. The last place I had access to a miracle that could enlarge temporarily was all the way back in Island 2, and if I needed to go all the way back there and babysit a one-shot miracle all the way through to Island 5, I might as well have restarted the entire game, which I didn't do. Actually, saying all that, there's a little extra twist I need to add. Having played through all of the games in this video and written this entire script, just before sitting down to record this voiceover, I launched the game to double check I wasn't misremembering the existence of multiplayer in the original release. I did then do a little faffing around on the final island and discovered I could have got my creature just around the edge of the opponent's zone of control to the village I was talking about. This means I could have beaten it without restarting, teeny tiny creature and all, but the fact I'm only realising it about 10 minutes before sitting down to record these words, I think my point still stands about the game's lack of clarity surrounding how it wants to be played and how it actually presents itself to the player. And I don't think it's worth delaying the video for a few more days, given I'm not going to have anything to add based on a few more hours of grinding my way to the finish. I'll openly admit that I suck at Black and White. It's a difficult game to tap into the specific methods of play it's expecting of you in order to succeed, but that's often due to the amount of mechanical space it gives you to experiment with, and that exploration is what makes the game special. Its dedication to limiting your access to information and not fully explaining its more complex mechanics are what give the game its unique feel. It requires a few runs through to start getting the hang of things, but that obscurity is what gives the impression of playing as a god. You aren't in direct control of your people or your creature, they're things you're having to manage indirectly and hope you can get the results you want. This can be frustrating at times, but puzzling out these mechanics is also genuinely engaging, even when the game slows down. I can see the appeal in learning these mechanics fully, raising your creature to be a potent assistant, and then taking those skills to the various community-made maps available for the game's optional skirmish mode. At least, I think so. The reason you're expected to complete a game before talking about it is often framed in terms of dismissing a game that would turn out to be good later. I worry the opposite is true for Black and White. I know I didn't get to grips with the full extent of its mechanical toolset, but as much as the lack of transparency enhances the fantasy of playing a god, it might also obscure the fact that they just aren't as deep as they first seem. It feels deep, because it's difficult to fully grasp everything the game has to offer, but it might turn out once you battle through the obfuscation of its mechanics, there isn't all that much in the way to grasp anyway. I hope that's not the case, and for what it's worth I don't think it's the case. Regardless, mapping out the possibility space the game offers you is a great experience, even if it might turn out that actually understanding the game fully doesn't make playing it any more interesting. I suspect I'll dive back into the game one day for another go-through, better equipped with the mistakes of this run, but for now I don't have the patience to tackle the entire game again just to take another crack at the final island. Nemesis can have his land, I'm taking my idiot son on holiday. Creature Isles takes place during the main campaign, sometime between Land 1 and 5, but where exactly is unclear. There's a particularly memorable quest in the first island of the main game. Those of you who've played it before likely know which one I'm talking about without any more information. You help a group of sailors build a boat and fill it with food so they can sail away to new lands. If you help them, they appear in the 5th land and provide you with a second starting settlement to slightly improve your chances. Apparently they landed elsewhere before that, a mysterious island without gods. Telling the locals about you, their prayers summon you to the new land. During the events of the expansion you'll send them on their way once again to their final destination, but I'm not going to pretend continuity is an important factor in Creature Isles. The expansion stands almost entirely on its own. The action all takes place on just the one island, though it's larger than any in the base game. You're the only god too, so there's nothing to compete against, no time pressure to hurry your progress, but it's not a completely unstructured sandbox experience. It can be. The 3 villages on the map can be expanded and grown at your leisure, but there also seems to have been some tweaks to the balancing so they're far better at looking after themselves while your attention is elsewhere, and elsewhere it will be. The main crux of the expansion is this. The island is home to a group of creatures without gods. They've formed a small community, the Brotherhood, and you're set to completing various challenges with your creature so that he too can join the ranks of the Brotherhood. Also, it will earn him the right to bang the only female creature on the island, which is definitely a completely unnecessary addition. Equally unnecessary is her design, which granted could have been worse, but instead of simply being a unique panther creature with a woman's voice, they had to fall into that particularly annoying trope of giving her wide hips and tits because how else would you know she's a girl? She only appears briefly at the end, so despite being referenced throughout, she doesn't feel like she has much agency in the narrative. If anything, her inclusion is just kind of creepy. The other creatures found her as a baby and raised her, so the whole thing becomes a weird case of convincing a combination of her fathers, brothers, and rival suitors, and sometimes a combination of the 3, that your creature should have the right to mate with her based on your ability to cheat at bowling. The challenges make up the majority of the gameplay, and also the majority of the game's problems. Making an expansion focused on the creatures makes a lot of sense. It was one of the most interesting and engaging elements of the original game. The problem is, the expansion doesn't focus on any of the things that made the creature interesting. Instead of needing to train your creature in specific tasks or grant it new abilities, the vast majority of the challenges focus on self-contained minigames. Bowling, marbles, using the wind to blow a boat around, they're completely disconnected from what actually made the creature an interesting inclusion. Instead, they're more or less reduced to the game's mascots. It's suggested that improvements were made to the creature's AI, allowing it to better understand its training and to be taught more nuanced lessons, but if those improvements exist, there's never a point where they are demonstrated through the gameplay. Every challenge requires the direct control of the player in some way, completely negating what made the creature special in the first place. There are only 2 mechanics you are shown that expand upon what the creature was capable of before. Firstly, the creature can now be taught to construct buildings, slightly speeding up expansion, but I'm not sure this transfers back to the base campaign in the way it was intended, so its only use is in skirmish maps launched from within Creature Isles. The second is the creature's creature. In an attempt to prove your creature would be a good father, they're given the stewardship of a chicken. Tyke learns from your creature in much the same way the creature learns from you. The learning process is explained in more detail, which helps understanding how it works, but also makes it feel more generic. Again, this apprentice creature, as it's called, can be brought into skirmishes to follow your creature around and help, but not back to the original campaign. This is true of both the chicken you're given during the course of the expansion, and the tiny version of your creature you ultimately receive as your creepy prize for beating it. Without the structure of a campaign to work with, however, the expansion never really shows you the true capabilities of this second creature, so I'll never get to find out if my idiot son's idiot son would have tipped the balance of power in my fight against Nemesis. I played Black and White a lot as a child, but never had a chance to play the expansion. I was always fascinated by it though, it sounded great back then. I think as a child I might have enjoyed it as a larger sandbox to play in, given that's how I treated the base game, having never played Beyond Land 2. As an adult, I enjoy a more structured form of engagement with the systems, however, and trying to engage with the expansion on those terms is excruciating. The challenges vary from slightly irritating to an exercise in frustration. In more than a few challenges, the most effective method of completing it is to cheat, because playing through them legitimately would require godly amounts of patience. Completing each one unlocks the ability to switch your creature to one of that type, and the ability to fight them freely at the dojo. This isn't a great reward, given how even in the base game, the creature fights were by far the weakest and most imprecise mechanic the game had to offer. I was excited to play Creature Isles, since I had wanted to ever since I played the original as a child. It's a shame that after all that time what I found was a poorly implemented set of challenges that don't utilise any of the actually interesting elements of the underlying game. If improvements had been made, they aren't apparent. The only benefit I can see to it is as a training ground before going into skirmish mode, to start a new profile, train up your creature in the open sandbox, then test them against the community maps for the skirmish mode. But those community maps are likely to be a far better way to spend your time if you're looking for more Black and White. The team originally intended to release 2 expansions. While this one would focus on creatures, the other was to focus on the other element people liked about the base game, the real-time strategy and management side of things. That expansion, dubbed Super Gods, never came to be. Instead, many of its ideas would be folded into development of the sequel. What is a god game? I realise that half an hour deep into a video about Black and White is an odd time to bring up the topic, but bear with me. Genre is a tricky thing. Even in passive media, it's kind of a mess. It is at once a set of conventions and an indicator of intent by the author, and a categorization system to make suggestions and discovery easier for the audience. Genre can find itself with aesthetic qualities, such as fantasy, or thematic ones, such as in romance. A fantasy novel lends itself best to an adventure story, but there's no reason it couldn't be a political thriller, romance, or any other more thematically focused genre as well. This only gets more complicated in games where the mechanical interaction adds an entirely different dimension to the discussion. This is how you end up in a system where Portal 2, Fallout New Vegas, and Call of Duty Black Ops 7 can all wind up being considered first-person shooters. God games sit at a difficult crossroads, having a mix of thematic, aesthetic, and mechanical values to adhere to, where failure to do so quickly shifts the work into other genres. A game where you manage a population of people you have no direct control over, where you plan their settlements and influence their world, but can't control them directly, and where you can drop meteors on them if they displease you, might sound like a god game, but it also describes Cities Skylines. It seems obvious that Cities Skylines is not a god game, and yet it's not entirely clear what the actual distinction is. Black and White 2 maintains many of the mechanics, aesthetics, and themes of the original, and yet they have all been changed or rearranged in such a manner that I'm not sure it's even a god game anymore. At the same time, however, it is, by a lot of metrics, arguably the better game. Mechanics are tighter, information and feedback more directly available. Even the expected methods of play and mechanical rhythms are more clearly conveyed to the player, and yet it's because of those reasons that it feels like a worse god game. Take building, for example. In the original, you had your workshop build scaffolds, and then you would stack them on top of one another to indicate which building they would produce when placed. Mechanically, this isn't that different from Black and White 2. You still have control over which building is being placed, and exactly where, and they still cost different amounts of resources to produce. And yet, Black and White 2's system of simply selecting a building from a list and placing it feels so much less godly in its execution. The obfuscation, the distance between your actions and its results, as well as the feeling of being physically part of the world, are gone, and with them goes the feeling of being a god rather than a city planner. You'll be doing a lot of city planning, mind you. The game ultimately ends up being a cross between a light real-time strategy and a light city builder. It's a combination that actually feels very modern, what with the recent wave of similar combinations of city builder and other genres. Which element is emphasised comes from the game's new alignment system. Playing as good or evil now has a significant mechanical distinction. As good, your goal is to build up your city to impress your opponent's people enough to join it. As evil, your goal is to build up your military enough to take over those other settlements. This dual gameplay does lend the impression that you need to dedicate yourself to one or the other, but that's not necessarily the case. You can, but each faces problems that the other can resolve more easily, so a middle ground is often preferable. Building a big city, an impressive city, requires a lot of resources and takes up a lot more space. The main resource bottleneck for much of the game is no longer wood, it grows quicker and your followers no longer have the environmental policy of a Brazilian dictator, so it doesn't take as much careful maintenance to avoid total deforestation. The problem is ore. It's a resource that is required in a lot of larger buildings and in equipping troops, but it's a finite resource on each map. There's only a limited supply, and if you're playing good, even more so, since your single city won't have access to mines further afield. Reaching the impressiveness level required to capture a town doesn't take control of it like the military would, rather its people migrate to join yours, limiting you to what resources you have near your own city and what meagre trappings those migrants bring with them. This means even playing good, it can be worth having a few troops available to take settlements, even empty ones, with access to their own richer mines to act as resource outposts. At the same time, evil settlements are quicker to build and can cram more people in smaller spaces. This helps keeping up the population necessary to field a decent army, but lowers happiness significantly, which severely reduces production speeds. Attempting to stick to a middle ground is helpful, therefore, in mitigating the problems of either playstyle, either striking out for resources as a good god, or trying to keep your citizens in better spirits as an evil one. There are two major limiting factors in playing in this middle ground, or switching as the circumstance requires. The first is impressiveness. It's mostly calculated based on the types of buildings you have, your available housing, and the bonuses associated with building in certain areas, but there's also a modifier tied to your morality. Good gods get a not insignificant bonus to impressiveness, and evil gods get an equal reduction, making switching back and forth tricky, or at the very least makes switching from evil to good tricky. A good god can turn into a militant nightmare state at a moment's notice, so again, maybe the morality at play does have some depth to it. The other limiting factor is tribute. You get it for completing objectives, including the side quests that rewarded you with map-specific upgrades in the first game. You spend tribute on unlocking new buildings and miracles. There's not enough to get everything in a single playthrough, so you want to exercise some prudence in its use, saving it first for buildings and abilities that align with your intended route through the game. This is what I mean when I say it no longer feels like playing a god though. If you're in a good route, you're playing a relatively competent city builder, managing your resources to build a single mega city with some defense against your opponent's armies. In the evil route, you're playing a simplified RTS where you're managing your resources to maintain a large enough army and capture towns across the map. Both feel pretty good, and the modes complement one another surprisingly well when you start combining them, but your control is so much more direct that it feels like you're controlling your people as a leader rather than indirectly influencing them as a god. The mechanics are so much clearer, the control is so much more focused on using a toolbar rather than the more diegetic systems of the first game. By distancing itself from the obfuscation of the original, it is also distancing itself from the immersion that provided. It's a good game, but it's also so much more clearly a game. Nowhere is this clearer, however, than with the changes to your creature. The creatures have been hugely simplified, or at least it feels that way. There's no longer a broad selection which you can change throughout the game, you choose one at the start and then keep it throughout. They also don't need you to keep quite as close an eye on them, they're much better at maintaining their own needs, and while there may be some management required if you want to keep them at peak muscle and fitness, they won't fail to grow to their much reduced maximum size if you slack off on looking after them. The biggest change is to their training, however. Instead of the 3 leashes that encouraged being nice, being mean, and learning from before, now you can set them to free will or one of 4 actions that they will try to accomplish. Individual training can be done to encourage or discourage certain behaviours while they're in free will mode, but they aren't capable of complex multi-step tasks anymore. Or to be more accurate, it's easier to tell that they aren't capable of them. This is because you're given every piece of information you might want about the creature up front in the toolbar. Not just the basic stats that used to appear in the temple, but the specifics of every task they've learned and whether you've trained them to do it or not. You can even select any task you want and change its status on the fly. This means instead of keeping an eye on the creature and encouraging or discouraging actions as it performs them, you can simply leave it to its own devices for a while, then work your way through the entire list to set the creature exactly to your preferred specifications. You don't even teach it miracles directly anymore, the ability to cast miracles and upgrades to its 4 modes to make it better at carrying resources or stronger in battle are all bought with tribute. The creature is more reliable and easier to control than before, but those facts make it feel so much more like a tool to be used, rather than a mechanic to be interacted with. It is, however, a hell of a useful tool. In the original, an evil creature was basically nothing more than a liability. Unless you were playing multiplayer and deliberately angling to have your creature harass your opponent's settlements, there were only drawbacks to having your creature smashing buildings and eating villagers. The dual methods of play available in Black and White 2 gives the creature a lot more versatility in its usage, and it makes a good case for keeping a creature whose alignment doesn't match your own. As a good god, you still need to defend your walls and keep the enemy at bay, and even at their reduced maximum height, a 30-foot lion is still an impressive deterrent, so training yourself a war beast is a good investment. Meanwhile, as an evil god, your production at home is severely limited, and though powerful, the creature is still vulnerable if you aren't nearby to back it up. Its tactical use as a single super unit can't be denied, but it can only be in one place at a time, and if you already have a large army, it may be worth keeping your creature back to bolster your citizens' production instead. The game does a better job of communicating what it thinks of as a standard rhythm before it starts throwing you curveballs. The 3 lands that make up the introduction consist of a basic movement and controls tutorial, a quick story introduction, and then a more extended tutorial surrounding the game's city building and real-time strategy systems. Once into the main bulk of the game, every level has the same overarching goal of taking the enemy city, either by force or by civic planning. But it introduces complications slowly across its 6 lands and 3 cultures. The decision to limit the player to only a Greek civilization is disappointing, given how much the variety of cultures added to the first game, especially given the more in-depth city building. I found myself capturing empty enemy settlements just so I could steal their buildings to build small enclaves of Japanese buildings in my own city. The gradual escalation in difficulty works well, and the removal of the ability to bring resources between lands means each one can be a tailored challenge and restarted on its own a few times if you're struggling with it, only requiring you restart the entire game if you somehow completely mess up your tribute purchases. The Norse act as an introductory enemy, though are also the first time you have limited access to ore. The Japanese first fight you with a passive city builder who races you to impress the settlements in between, then an aggressive military opponent who harasses you constantly, before finally pitting you against both at once. Each of these levels mixes up your access to resources in small ways, but they really amp it up as you reach the Aztecs in the late game. Your first foray against them is in a desert where land for growing wood and food is severely limited, making them as difficult to manage as your ore supply. The final land, however, starts you with your settlement already built up a little, but quickly attacks it, leaving you to fend off the first wave and rebuild. More difficult, however, is that it's the only map that doesn't start you with access to a mine, meaning you only have what ore is in your stores to build with. This is also the best example of why playing a mix of good and evil helps you balance out the weaknesses of either playstyle. Each of the 3 Aztec cities in the final level has access to a rare bottomless mine, but since taking the cities by impressiveness moves their population to yours, you aren't getting your hands on them that way. The best way I found to tackle the level as good was to dedicate my first hand to quickly building up as big an army as I could muster. Then, as the Norse and Japanese sent military aid, using that combined force to take one of the Aztec settlements and transferring my entire population over. This had the added benefit of letting me build in peace as the Aztecs continued to attack my now empty starting settlement, giving me free range to let loose with my full arsenal of miracles without risking any collateral damage. These kinds of challenges were exciting and engaging in ways the original game had never really managed to achieve, but at the same time, it still feels less like playing a god. The combination of city building and tactical military action is good and works well, but the clarity of your interactions and the precision of your control disrupts the immersion that made the original so memorable. The black and white games continue to exist in a legal limbo at the moment, though fans of the games, the original especially, have been clamouring for the digital re-release for some time. I completely understand why people want access to the first game. It's a genuinely unique experience that no game has presented since, but I suspect the second would be an easier sell to a modern audience. It's not perfect, there are balance issues here and there, the odd bug too, but it's much more complete, much easier to understand, and a far clearer game than its predecessor that fits into the specific style of city builders that have become more popular in recent years. It's funny in that way. The first game was considered ahead of its time due to its originality, but its approaches and systems were never replicated, making it very much a product of its time. The sequel felt like a step backwards at launch, like an uneven combination of genres that lost all of the original appeal of the first game, and yet it was genuinely ahead of its time, fitting in far better with the modern crop of themed city builders and hybrid RTS systems that have become more popular in recent years. The expansion wouldn't push this any further, mind you, but if we learned anything from Creature Isles, it's that maybe that's a good thing. Battle of the Gods is the kind of expansion the first game could have done with. It doesn't advance the gameplay all that much, doesn't throw any major new features or mechanical switch-ups at you. It's simply a few extra levels of the core gameplay, which is why, despite the fact the original could have used it, it's not that great an extension to the sequel. Black and White 2 already had enough of both the more baseline gameplay and some challenging twists. It could have used a more experimental expansion like Creature Isles, though what's here is still a solid addition if you wanted a little more after beating the base game. Like the base game, each of these 3 new levels mixes up which resources you're going to struggle acquiring. The first is the most interesting, starting you out with no men in your settlement, meaning you either need to rush to capture or impress another village, or find and release where the men of the town are being held before your population completely dies out. The second gives you a reasonable amount of ore, but spreads it out over a large area around your starting zone, meaning you can only access a little at a time, especially since most of those mines aren't near easily capturable outposts. The final level starts you out with a pretty built up town already, but you're in a race to stop your opponent from activating their Hurricane Wonder and blowing your entire starting town away. They all present interesting challenges, only slightly undercut by one of the new mechanics. There are a few new buildings, a hospital that passively heals your people, an abattoir to let you make food from animals, some other smaller additions too. More impactfully is a handful of new miracles, one of which completely breaks the balance of the game. The Life Miracle resurrects recently deceased units or civilians and damages the new undead units being levied against you. It also, for reasons unknown, will completely fill a storehouse with food and ore, assuming there's already at least a little in there. This throws the balance off completely once you get the miracle, because prayer power generates far quicker than food with an equivalent number of disciples, leaving you with functionally infinite food and ore as long as you're careful to never run out completely. Something you won't do because it's easy to just build a few extra storehouses and fill them all as backup. While this does somewhat trivialise the city management portions of the game, it doesn't trivialise the game as a whole, since your new opponent is a worthy one indeed. The base game would have your enemies attacking your own towns from the midpoint onwards, but never in great force. A wall was enough to keep the men out, and the siege weapons needed to get close enough that they weren't usually too much of a problem to deal with. Your opponent is much more aggressive this time, sending more units more often against you, and this time they're backed up by their own god. Every enemy in the base game was simply a human ruler of the given civilization, but in the final cutscene the defeated Aztec leader besieges a god for aid, and the god answered. This new god resurrects the Aztecs and strikes against you. The new undead units are numerous, though not a great deal more powerful than the Aztecs they were in life. Arguably weaker in fact, since they no longer have access to the flaming arrows that were so dangerous to your creature, rendering him a far more powerful military asset. The god does, however, mean you're now subject to all the abilities you have at your disposal. The enemy god's miracles allow for more ways for them to mess with you midway through a land, beyond simply sending out more troops. There's a handful of pre-scripted ones, but the most interesting to deal with is exclusive to the final island. The enemy god, in addition to sending a constant stream of units to your gates, will intermittently unleash a range of offensive miracles at your town. Having to keep an eye out for incoming fireballs doesn't just make the shield miracle finally useful, it also keeps you on your toes, properly escalating the conflict into a fight rather than a chilled out city builder where someone just shouts at you occasionally. Accidentally missing the sign he's about to start tossing miracles your way while distracted, and then finding half your settlement is on fire, meteors are raining from the sky, and he summoned several platoons inside your walls is a good way to liven up proceedings, giving you something sudden and important to deal with that interrupts the more relaxed, gradual expansion of your town. Battle of the Gods isn't a game-changing addition to the sequel, but it does add a few extra interesting challenges, even if it loses a few of its teeth once you work out the deal with the Life Miracle. The only other problem with the expansion is a tonal one. Side quests in the base game had a tendency to feel completely unrelated to what was going on around them. They were self-contained mini-games, more in line with the challenges of Creature Isles than the side quests of the original that were more likely to integrate into the land better. That doesn't change in the expansion, in fact the side quests feel even more isolated, but they also feel tonally dissonant in a way they didn't before. There's an undead god, raising the corpses of friend and foe alike, subjugating the free peoples of the world and demanding sacrifices of the innocent, all in the goal of destroying your last followers and erasing you from existence, leaving him free to eliminate all life on the planet and reign eternal over the land of the dead. But can you click on these statues in the right order to get the skeletons to dance to a jaunty tune? Side content in the base campaign certainly felt a lot like something to occupy you while your citizens get on with actually building everything you just laid out, but here it feels like maybe there's something more important you should be doing. The humour just feels out of place against the darker backdrop the expansion has going for it. In a recent interview concerning his new game, Masters of Albion, Peter Molyneux lamented the decline of the God game, noting that people just didn't care about it anymore. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but I do think people looking for these kinds of games are far better served by the expansion of related genres. This makes the specific and very narrow genre niche of God games a difficult one to thrive in, since there's so much competition from similar games. While themed city builders, survival management and hybrid RTS games are relatively popular these days, in the years since Black and White came to an end, I'd argue that only two major attempts to recapture the pure God game have emerged: Ubisoft's 2011 game From Dust and Molyneux's own much maligned Goddess, both of which leaned more into the landscape-altering mechanics of Populous than the population management of Black and White. While the specifics of the controls have been lost, a great deal of games now exist which focus on you indirectly controlling populations via their living arrangements, both large and small, in the way Black and White did. Even Masters of Albion appears to have a greater focus on resource management and managing production supply lines than you would expect a god to be doing. The genre never really died in the way people make it out. It just merged and crossed over with so many others that a pure God game becomes a difficult thing to build, since only a little change aesthetically, thematically or mechanically can tip it into another genre entirely. This was already apparent in the changes from Black and White to the sequel. These kinds of high-level management games in the vein of Black and White 2 are everywhere at the moment, so if that's what you enjoyed, there's a lot out there that will scratch that itch, though I'll admit, none of them make you feel quite like a god in the way the original does. Thanks for watching.
Oh, we got this notion that we quite like to sail the ocean, so we're building a big boat to leave here for good. We're not keen on sinking, so we're all sitting here thinking, 'cause we built it too big and we've run out of wood. Idly, we simply can't leave till we get some more wood. Oh, we're not keen on sinking, so that's why we're sitting thinking, 'cause